this. For anyone who's into history, theology, really just the architecture of power, this is a deep dive right into the bedrock of human civilization.
It really is.
We're looking at ancient Mesopotamian creation narratives,
Right.
Texts like the Enūma Eliš and the traditions that later show up in Genesis.
Right. And when you read these texts the traditional way, they're treated as pure cosmology. There's stories about how the gods made the universe, formed the physical world.
How they set the stars and all that.
Exactly. And in that reading, heaven and earth are, well, they're straightforward. The sky above, the ground below.
That's the consensus, and it has been for thousands of years. But today, we are going to challenge that, well, completely.
We are.
We're exploring Safa Kaçmaz's really radical theory of social duality. And our mission here is to understand this very counterintuitive claim that these huge cosmological terms are actually codes.
Highly specific sociopolitical codes for two distinct human societies. The hook here is, it's pretty simple, but it just shatters traditional scholarship. Kaçmaz argues that heaven, or Gok, and earth, Yer, they aren't cosmic realms at all.
So what are they?
They're legal and political names for Akkad and Sumer. And if you accept that, well, every story about the creation of the world suddenly becomes a story about the creation of a social order.
That is a staggering claim. It just flips everything on its head.
It does.
So to get this, we have to start with the classic view of Akkad and Sumer, and then, see why Kaçmaz says it's wrong.
Okay, so classically, historians see Sumer and Akkad as two really vibrant, distinct civilizations in Mesopotamia.
Right, they were neighbors.
Neighbors. They lived side by side, they traded, they borrowed culture from each other, and yes, they fought a lot for control of the region.
So they were interacting, sometimes competing, but still separate.
Fundamentally separate political entities. That's the traditional view.
So why isn't that model enough? Why couldn't they just be, neighbors who sometimes got along and sometimes didn't? What's the evidence that points to something deeper?
It's because the texts themselves suggest a deliberate structural opposition. It goes way beyond just rivalry.
Okay.
I mean, if they were just neighbors, their foundational myths wouldn't be so obsessed with categorizing every single aspect of existence, from their gods to their water sources, into this constant Akkad versus Sumer dichotomy.
So it's too consistent to be an accident.
Exactly. This pervasive, almost enforced polarization means they weren't just two kingdoms next to each other. They were structured as two interdependent halves of a single, larger political system.
A dual state, basically, built on these ideological fault lines.
Yeah.
So where does the code land on the actual map?
This is where we bring heaven and earth, down to human geography. Kaçmaz lays out that heaven Gok is the specific term for the Akkadian society representing the north.
The Norse.
And earth Yo is the specific term for the Sumerian society representing the south.
So when the texts talk about the separation of heaven and earth,
they are describing the formal legal separation and the definition of the Akkadian and Sumerian political spheres.
Wow. So the oldest stories we have are less about the majesty of cosmic creation and more about a founding political deal. The creation myth is a political constitution.
Precisely. It is a sociological reading. It turns what we all thought was theology into historical and political archival material.
It's one thing to say they were opposed, but what gives this opposition its sacred status? It sounds like we need to look at the ground beneath their feet, which I guess brings us to the structuralist grid.
The whole foundation is geographical. It's centered on the Euphrates River, which, runs generally north to south.
Okay, that makes sense.
The above-north orientation naturally corresponds to the Akkadian territory, which became coded as heaven.
And below south is Sumer, so they become earth.
That's it. This simple physical distinction, above versus below, was later codified. It was sanctified through ritual naming in the myths, which transformed a simple location into a kind of destiny.
But to justify a claim this big, you can't just rely on geography, right? You'd need a whole system that proves this polarization was, deliberate.
Yes. And that's why Kaçmaz uses a structuralist lens. He consciously adopted an anthropological model based on Claude Lévi-Strauss's work.
Lévi-Strauss.
Yeah.
For anyone who doesn't know, he's the guy who argued that cultures create meaning through binary opposition, right?
That's the one. We understand light because it's the opposite of dark. good because it's the opposite of evil.
So if you apply that to Mesopotamia, you're looking for the ultimate binary pair that defines the whole system.
Exactly. And the argument is that Akkad and Sumer are that ultimate binary, and that opposition defines literally everything else.
Okay, so this model allowed him to show how deep this split went.
It did. It showed how every single aspect of life was polarized along this Akkad equals heaven versus Sumer equals earth axis. Let's just go through some of the binaries. You can really see how this constitutional framework seeped into everything.
Okay, start with the most basic one, the economy.
Right. The Akkadian society, heaven, was systematically coded as nomadic, the shepherd life.
And Sumer.
Sumerian society, earth, was coded as settled, the farmer life. And this wasn't just, a description of their jobs. It was a political statement about who controlled which resources.
That makes perfect sense for north versus south. The north is often more plateaued grazing land, while the south is that heavily irrigated farmland near the delta.
And that split immediately extends to the celestial spheres.
How so?
Akkad, the shepherd society, was associated with the sun, day, light, and white.
Okay, so Sumer, the farmer society, gets the opposite.
Exactly. They were associated with the moon, night, darkness, and black. Even the rhythm of light and shadow becomes a political marker.
That's wild. I mean, the sun is above, so it's linked to the North Heaven people. The moon, well, it's often seen as lower, connected to tides and water, which links it to the South Earth people.
The polarization is it's so thorough. It even applies to value system.
Value, you mean like currency?
Yes. Akkad was associated with gold. Sumer was associated with silver.
Okay, that's not just a preference. That establishes a tiered system of tribute of value.
It institutionalizes economic inequality. If your society is symbolically linked to silver, your resources are fundamentally valued differently than a society linked to gold.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, because this duality wasn't just practical. It defined the theological structure of their kinship, their creation stories. The list of theological prototypes is genuinely shocking.
It is. The Akkad heaven side is connected to the prototypes of the mortal god, the younger son, and the perfect son. Kaçmaz actually connects this forward to what he calls the Jesus prototype.
And the summer earth side.
That's linked to the living God, the elder son, the first great son, and the imperfect son, which is linked to the Adam prototype.
Wait, hold on. If these are political contracts, why use these incredibly dense layers of theological figures? Why not just write down a treaty? Akkad gets the gold in the north, Sumer gets the silver in the south. Why mask it in mythology?
That's the crucial point. They had to mask it.
Why?
Because in early societies, religious language is the highest form of constitutional authority. If you want a political deal to last for generations, to become unquestionable, you don't write it on a clay tablet signed by one king.
You embed it in the story of how the universe began.
Yes, because that narrative holds divine authority. The theology is the political propaganda. It ensures compliance.
So every creation story is a form of sacred, institutionalized political messaging.
And that brings us to the physical environment. Even water, the source of all life in Mesopotamia, is split by this code. Cold water versus hot water. River, the Euphrates, flowing through Akkad versus the sea, the marshy delta of Sumer, fresh water versus salt water. The entire world was dualized down to the molecules.
That structural framework is so comprehensive, it really forces you to read these stories in a new way. Which brings us to reinterpreting the creation lists and rituals themselves.
This is the revolutionary takeaway. Kaçmaz insists these creation narratives are not cosmological. They are fundamentally sociopolitical texts. We have to strip away the idea of a spiritual beginning of the universe and replace it with the political beginning of a societal structure.
Okay, so let's apply that new lens. When the ancient texts list the creation of living beings, all the animals, what are we actually reading if it's not a biology textbook?
We're reading a symbolic code for the clan hierarchy and social alliance systems of this new dual society.
A hierarchy.
Yes. Kaçmaz actually connects this kind of animal totemism way back to the earliest temple cultures, like the symbols you see at Göbekli Tepe. This coding is profoundly ancient.
So how does it work? How do the animals define status in the Akkadian Sumerian system?
Well, at the top, the ruling elite clans were symbolically coded as birds.
Birds, because they're in the sky.
Exactly. They are closest to the heaven society of Akkad, soaring above. The middle tier, the middle-level clans, were symbolized by land animals.
Makes sense.
And at the very bottom, symbolizing the ritually castrated lower classes, were the reptiles.
That is heavy. But the reptile coding makes structural sense. They're creatures of the earth and the below Sumer's territory.
While birds are creatures of the above or heaven Akkad's territory, it is an explicit visual map of the class structure at the time.
The social pecking order, literally documented in sacred language.
And this sociopolitical coding extends directly into ritual life. The rituals were the enforcement mechanism for these constitutional boundaries.
So you'd see this legal separation in the rituals themselves.
Exactly. For instance, you see these contrasting sacrifice rituals, the cold water river sacrifice versus the hot water boiling sacrifice.
Yeah.
Those aren't just, random differences in worship. They are legal indicators of distinct political frameworks for the Akkadian and Sumerian societies. The ritual you performed defined your legal status.
And looking at these boundaries through such an unflinching lens, it leads to some pretty controversial details, like the role of ritual cannibalism.
Yes, Kaçmaz discusses this in the context of boundary maintenance. He identifies ritual cannibalism not as some, barbaric anomaly, but as a specific regulatory element of this social duality. In his interpretation, it's a terrifying but functionally necessary practice. It was designed to violently enforce the separation and hierarchy that was written into these constitutional texts. It ensured the dominance of one coded group over another.
That shifts the focus completely from just shock value to sociological function.
Yeah.
The ritual exists to keep the system in place.
That's the essence of the whole theory. It forces us to ask, what purpose did this ritual serve in regulating Akkad's power over Sumer or vice versa?
Okay, so let's zoom out for that. So what's insight? If this theory holds, what are the broader implications for how we approach sacred texts from all ancient cultures?
The shift is monumental. We are no longer viewing these religious texts as just theological documents trying to satisfy spiritual curiosity.
We're viewing them as what?
As constitutional documents.
Yeah.
Or founding constitutions of early human societies. The creation myth becomes the earliest form of the rule of law.
So the theology acts as a kind of ultimate filing cabinet for historical and political agreements, the divine seal on a human political deal.
Precisely. This approach views the symbolic language of religious literature as a dense, encrypted historical sociological archive. It gives us a key to decode political realities, resource divisions, class stratification, all the stuff that was deliberately obscured by mythology.
It offers an incredibly valuable alternative academic reading. It sort of bypasses traditional religious studies and opens up new avenues for anthropology by forcing us to see these ancient stories as records of political deals.
It pushes us to accept that the earliest forms of organized belief may have been less about contemplating the abstract nature of the gods, and more about establishing who gets to rule, who is the shepherd, who is the farmer, and how to divide resources between the north and the south.
It's fascinating. By applying this grid, Kaçmaz achieves a massive interpretive shift take, the ultimate symbols of existence, heaven and earth, out of the cosmos and placing them right into the fierce political landscape of Akkad and Sumer.
It's a profound act of reclaiming human history from the divine narrative. It shows us that ancient people were just as concerned with political deals and hierarchies as we are today.
Right. So here's the final thought for you to carry forward from this deep dive. If the symbolic language of the world's earliest creation myths, these stories of heaven and earth, functions primarily as a historical sociological archive documenting specific political alliances and social stratification, does this mean we should view all subsequent sacred texts, even those we study today, primarily as disguised foundational constitutions rather than pure theology? What crucial human history are we inadvertently missing by focusing only on the divine?